In Europe, a peculiar and popular way to make money had emerged over the years, buying the contents of abandoned storage units. This practice, known as storage unit auctions, had become a thriving business for those with a keen eye for hidden treasures and forgotten antiques. Martin, an unassuming man in his mid-30s, wasn't wealthy by any means, but he managed to scrape by, making a modest living from selling the junk and occasional antiques he found in these units. Storage unit auctions were straightforward but thrilling affairs. When renters failed to pay their storage fees for several months, the contents of their units would be put up for auction. But potential buyers, like Martin, would gather at the storage facility, eager to bid on these mysterious and often neglected lots. The rules were simple. The unit was opened for a brief inspection, usually no more than a cursory glance from the doorway before the bidding began. Bidders weren't allowed to rummage through the items beforehand, which meant they had to rely on their instincts and experience to determine the potential value of the unit's contents. Martin lived modestly in an old apartment on the outskirts of the city. The building he lived in had seen better days. Peeling paint on the walls, creaky floors, and dim lighting gave it a sense of faded grandeur that had turned into neglect. Martin's apartment was small, consisting of a single bedroom, a tiny living room, a cramped kitchen, and a narrow bathroom. The furniture in his apartment was as old and worn as the building itself. In the living room stood an ancient sofa, upholstered in frayed velvet, with visible signs of numerous repairs. On a shelf above the sofa was a collection of various antique items he had found at storage unit auctions: old clocks, bronze figurines, and leather-bound books. It was both his pride and his source of income. He slept on an iron bed with a sagging mattress. The only decoration in the bedroom was a lamp with a shade that cast a warm light, creating a cozy atmosphere in the small space. In the corner of the bedroom stood an old writing desk, piled high with papers, books, and various trinkets he had collected on his trips to the storage units. The kitchen was minimally equipped: an ancient refrigerator, a gas stove, and a few pots and pans. The kitchen walls were adorned with yellowed floral wallpaper. On the windowsill sat a few pots with dried-up plants that Martin couldn't bring himself to throw away. Martin lived alone. He had no family, and his friends were few. Mostly they were fellow treasure hunters he occasionally met at auctions. He spent his leisure time reading books he found in the storage units and watching old movies on his battered television. His life was measured and quiet, despite the constant feeling that he was living on the edge. Occasionally, he thought about changing his life, finding a more stable job, or even moving to another city, but habit and fear of the unknown kept him in place. Every morning he woke up, made himself a cup of cheap instant coffee, and set off for another auction, hoping to find something valuable. These moments of searching and anticipating new discoveries gave his life meaning, filling it with adrenaline and hope for a better future. For Martin, this was both an art and a gamble. Each auction was a chance to uncover something valuable, something that could be sold for a handsome profit. His success depended on his ability to spot promising signs in the brief moments he had to inspect the unit. Old furniture, antique-looking trunks, and even stacks of boxes could hold valuable items like vintage jewelry, rare books, or collectibles. But just as often, they held nothing but worthless junk. Despite the risks, Martin found the process exhilarating. There was a sense of adventure in not knowing what he might find, and the satisfaction of turning an overlooked item into a source of income. His small apartment was filled with the remnants of his finds: old clocks, bronze figurines, and leather-bound books, each with its own story and potential value. Every morning, he would scan listings and notifications for upcoming auctions, circling dates in his worn-out calendar. The night before an auction, he'd prepare by going over his notes and checking his finances, making sure he had enough money to bid. He'd wake up early, make himself a cup of cheap instant coffee, and drive to the storage facility, anticipation bubbling inside him. Storage unit auctions were a lifeline for Martin, offering not just a way to make a living, but also a sense of purpose and excitement. Each unit he bought was a new mystery to unravel, a new chance to strike it lucky. And it was this very practice that led him to the fateful evening when the manager of his regular storage facility called with a special offer, an offer that would change his life forever. Late one evening, Martin's phone rang. It was the manager of a storage facility he frequented. "Martin, I have a special offer for you," the manager said, his voice sounding unusually strained. "An old woman just vacated her unit. It's filled with, well, things I think you might find interesting. The price is more than fair." Intrigued and always on the lookout for a good deal, Martin agreed without hesitation. He drove to the facility, a sense of anticipation bubbling inside him. When he arrived, the manager was waiting for him, looking unusually pale and nervous. "Are you okay?" Martin asked, concerned. Yes, the manager replied, avoiding eye contact. I want to apologize. I hope you understand." Martin frowned, puzzled by the manager's strange behavior, but shrugged it off. Business was business. They completed the transaction quickly. Martin now had the keys to the unit. He walked down the dimly lit corridor, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. When he reached the unit, he inserted the key, but the lock wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he stepped back and pulled out his phone to call the manager. As he did, the door creaked open by itself. A shiver ran down his spine, but he shook it off and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and a faint, musty odor hung in the air. He began sorting through the items, his initial excitement waning as he found nothing of real value, just old clothes, faded photographs, and tarnished trinkets. He didn't mind too much. The price had been low, and he could break even easily. Among the clutter, Martin noticed an abundance of occult books and strange, dried herbs. Curious, he picked up one of the books and flipped through its pages, filled with bizarre symbols and incantations. He felt a chill as he continued his search, a sense of being watched creeping over him. Behind a heavy velvet curtain, he found an ancient chest. Unlike the other items, this one called to him. It was as if a voice inside his head urged him to open it. He tried the key, but it was useless. The lock was unlike any he had seen before. Frustrated but determined, Martin rummaged through the books again. He found a worn leather tome that seemed different from the others. As he read, he realized this chest belonged to a dark witch and could only be opened with a drop of sinful blood. His heart pounded as he processed the information. This was madness. But the whispering voice grew louder, compelling him to follow through. Driven by an unexplainable force, Martin grabbed a rusty nail from the floor and pricked his finger. A single drop of blood fell onto the lock. The chest shuddered, and then, with a final groan, it opened. Inside, there was a small, ornate mirror. Its surface was dark, reflecting nothing. As Martin reached out to touch it, the temperature in the unit plummeted. He heard a low, guttural whisper echoing in the room, growing louder and more insistent. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled, and Martin found himself staring at his own reflection. But it wasn't his face. It was twisted, malevolent, with eyes that glowed a sickly green. The reflection grinned, and Martin felt a cold hand grip his heart. He tried to pull away, but his gaze was locked. The room around him seemed to dissolve into darkness. The voice, now a cacophony of screams and laughter, filled his mind. The mirror's surface began to expand, swallowing the light and the air, pulling him into its abyss. In his final moments of consciousness, Martin understood the manager's apologies. The old woman hadn't simply vacated the unit, she had left behind a curse. In the moment when Martin realized that the curse had ensnared him, he felt his soul being engulfed by darkness. Fear gripped him, as if an icy hand clenched his heart. Whispers and screams echoed in his mind, sounds that couldn't possibly be real but pierced through his being, invoking indescribable terror. Darkness enveloped him, robbing him of the ability to breathe, move, even think. He felt his consciousness plunging into an abyss where there was no room for hope or salvation. It was a moment of absolute despair when he understood that he was trapped in a snare with no way out. In those moments, Martin saw visions of horrors and sufferings endured by those who had been subjected to this curse before him. He felt like a prisoner of his own nightmares, confined in a world of pain and horror from which there was no escape. But in this darkness, Martin found no strength to fight. He quickly surrendered, recognizing that his fate was sealed by the curse and that his attempts at resistance were futile. It was a moment when he realized that his life had forever changed and that he must accept his new reality, however horrifying it may be. When Martin realized his soul was trapped in the mirror, he understood that the only way to rid himself of this curse was to pass it on to someone else. It was something he had read about in the old books found in the Black Witch's storage unit. Martin speculated that the manager, apologizing to him several times and displaying strange signs of anxiety, might have known about the curse. Perhaps that's why he offered Martin this particular storage unit. Martin realized that, although he had been deceived, the manager had acted out of self-preservation. In the end, he had passed the curse on to Martin to free himself. Despite everything that had happened, Martin felt he couldn't blame him. He understood that fear and desperation could drive a person to actions they would never take under normal circumstances. Therefore, as his consciousness began to fade, Martin forgave the manager. He realized that life is full of complex choices and moments where we find ourselves on the edge. It's inevitable that someone among us will sometimes make mistakes. And accepting this fact, Martin embraced his fate as he departed to a world where the curse could no longer torment him. The storage unit door creaked closed, leaving behind a chilling silence.